I've been in meetings with huge companies and they say, the reason we use Linux. Somebody says, technically this good, and this is good, and all the community is great. And they say, no. And companies have to learn this. IBM and Intel famously, decades ago, said it's cheaper and faster to contribute upstream. Yet companies refuse to learn that. There's a Harvard Business Review paper, they refuse to learn that, and they want to find. He convinced management that this was going to work. And they made the bet, IBM made the bet, they put, $1 billion into it. So IBM's in the business of selling hardware and services, right? So they want to sell chips or systems. And I was there, they made a very good pitch to some people saying,
hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out season 2 episodes with Samson Gotti,
open source is interesting,
Claire Dillon,
great collaboration,
Wayne Starr,
freedom,
Stephen Wally,
good engineering,
Austin Bryan,
community,
Tom Sadler,
collaboration,
Greg Kroah-Hartman,
the best way to develop software,
Federico Gonzalez Waite,
limitless,
Amanda Brock,
the future, Gregory
Kurtzer,
collaborative,
Michael Dexter,
freedom,
and Kelsey Hightower.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Hello, everyone. I'm super excited, well, as always, but today especially because we have Greg Kroah-Hartman with us, and he is a longtime Linux kernel contributor as well as maintainer. So today we will dig into the Linux kernel community and ecosystem a little bit, and we will look at it from the perspective of corporate involvement. But before we dive into this topic area, Greg, can you please introduce yourself a little bit to our audience for people who don't know you? Like, what is your tech background and what do you do currently?
I'm a Linux kernel developer and maintainer. I've been doing this since the late 90s, so I'm one of the later people. I work with other people who've been here longer. I got involved with Linux from the driver point of view. I used to do embedded development. I did printers, I did barcode scanners, and I worked on the USB specification. And then Linux didn't have a USB specification or worked with USB at the time, and I started helping out and contributing that way. And then ended up doing more Linux work. But I started from the embedded world. So drivers, devices, really tiny stuff. That's where I came from as far as that goes. And I've been doing that maybe 5 or 6 years before I started doing Linux work. I was getting paid to do that kind of stuff. So so I started that. And then what I do now is I work for Linux Foundation. I'm a fellow. I am responsible for the stable releases for Linux. Linus does the development releases. He does a new release every 2.5 months. He just did one this past weekend. And then I do the stable releases, which go out every week, once or twice a week. And then we roll them on and go for there. And I've been doing that. We've been doing that for 15, 17 years now, that cadence of releases. Seems to work pretty well. And we got a good development. I'm not the only stable maintainer. I have some help along with that. But I've been doing that. I also maintain parts of the driver core, USB. I still maintain in the kernel, serial ports. My very first job out of college was working with serial ports, and I'm still working with serial ports 30 some years later. They'll never die. So lots of devices, lots of device type stuff. That's what I work on.
Do you remember how you discovered the free and open source software concept and movement?
Yeah, it's my wife. She wasn't my wife at the time. She had a university class. We were in the university together. And she had a university class that had a different speaker every week. And she came back and she said, hey, I had this weird speaker, somebody named Richard Stallman was talking about free software. You ever heard of that? I was like, no, I never heard about that. And that was like 91. I was like, okay. So then a couple years later, I started using Linux at my job because we were using SCO, Unix, and Windows and stuff like that. And Linux just worked. It worked much better than SCO because Oracle finally worked on it. I built my own kernel on my machine at home and started messing around with it a little bit. But then I didn't start really doing it for real till a couple years later. I had a device. I got involved with USB. Funnily enough, I was trying to get my device. I was doing barcode scanners. So we had to emulate a keyboard. And USB keyboards and mice are really, really close to each other as far as the way the specification works. And so I plugged in my barcode scanner that I was running the firmware for, and it showed up as a 102 button mouse. It's like, no, that's not right. So it was actually my fault in the firmware. So I figured it out and fixed it, but then I realized I could contribute to Linux. And I submitted a change, and they just took it. And I was like, hey, this is fun. And then I wrote it. My wife went away with my daughter for a weekend. She's like, why don't you write that driver you always been talking about? So I did. I wrote a driver and submitted it. And then instantly it was like, this is wrong, and oh, have you heard of multiprocessor stuff? It's like, what's multiprocessors? And I loved it. It was a good feedback loop. I was like, hey, this is going to make me be a better developer and better programmer, and my name's on it. So I fixed everything up. And funnily enough, the person who I asked, how do I write a patch, became my boss years and years later at SUSE. It's a small world. But I submitted my patch and got a driver in and started doing USB serial devices in the kernel. And then a few years, maybe a year after that, I realized more people were using the stuff I did for free than my day job, which I was getting paid for. And there was lots of Linux jobs available. And I took one in Portland, Oregon, working for a small startup doing security work, and been paid to do Linux work since '99, ever since.
So if I understand it correctly, you got more hands-on in touch with Linux through your work, but you were contributing at the beginning on your free time.
Yeah, exactly. I was doing it at work because I wanted to make sure my firmware worked with all operating systems. Funnily enough, the bug didn't show up under Windows, so it showed up as a keyboard and it worked just fine. But if I plugged it into Linux, it showed up right. And because Linux was more strict on its USB configuration, Windows was more flexible at the time. And then, yeah, it was just more fun, to be honest. It was a fun thing to do. And it's that feedback loop that I hit that was just really good. I mean, it's just from an engineering point of view, I want to do good work and I want to learn how to do things better. And the chance to have other people review your code in a way is something I never had happen. At my jobs, people would kind of review other people's code, but as long as the stuff worked, everybody was happy. But like go down function by function and line by line saying, hey, this is wrong, and why don't you do this better? To me, that was, I mean, there's a fun little dopamine hit, right? That's like, hey, oh yeah, I can do that better. I can do this better. And it became a better engineer because of that. And that's something everybody should want to achieve. It's fun.
Along the lines of evolution, I also want to touch on how the community and ecosystem evolved over time. Like you mentioned that when you got involved, you did have a job and you contributed to the kernel on your own time and not as part of that job. Was that mostly the pattern at that time, that most people contributed on their own time? Or when you started, were there already people who worked on the kernel as a paid job?
When I started, people were getting paid already. Most of the people were getting paid. And then I got paid. I got paid in '99 and worked on from then on. I was not getting paid to work on the kernel full time, just the kernel. It was always for my job, right? I think I can count on one hand the number of people that are allowed to just do whatever they want in the kernel. That's very rare, even still today. But I think 2003 or 2006, I graphed this. I said, what's the percentage wise? And at that time, it was over, I think 80% of the contributors were getting paid to do it. It was back in 2006 or 3, I'm not sure when I did that. And I've been tracking it with Linux Weekly News ever since. And it's been around between 80 and 85% of the contributors get paid. And the joke was you get 3 patches in the kernel and you get a job, and it's not really a joke. You get 3 patches and you get a job. And there's so much need for engineering talent to contribute to the kernel and not get paid for it is hard. So in a way, unless you're just doing some spelling fixes or you're just doing other types of stuff. Famously, we've had core kernel engineers try and retire, and then they get hired again. So, things like that, or kernel developers retire and they just contribute documentation stuff and other work that they want to do as retirement. We have a number of ex-Microsoft kernel developers working on Linux now too, because they're like, hey, this is a fun engineering thing, and we like doing this stuff. We're just going to do it in retirement. Wonderful. And usually they get hired. But yeah, so it's always been contributed, because Linux is something that companies use. I mean, hardware companies want their hardware to work. Famously, Dan Fry at IBM always used to come to me, I worked for IBM for a while, say, is Linux done this year? And I was like, no. And then it took me 10 years to come up with the answer. It's like, we'll be done when you stop making new hardware. So, I mean, Linux worked for me a long time ago, worked for Linus, what he said, 25 years ago. But everybody keeps coming out with new hardware and contributing. And so this makes our project pretty unique for software. Most software, you do a lot of development in the beginning, you solve the problem, and there's a long tail off of whatnot. Look at Kubernetes, huge, lots of development, now there's a tail off of development, maintaining. It's good stuff to do, but you're not doing a lot of new development. Linux kernel development has gone up, and it's been constantly going ever since, because new hardware, new devices, new environments in which it's used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, we don't see any rate of change slowing us down at all. We haven't slowed down in 10, 15 years, which is insane. Our rate of change is so high. Yeah, it's a weirdly unique product that way. So, but it's being contributed by companies who want to solve a problem. We're a tool, we're a hammer. You contribute because it's cheaper to contribute upstream to the product, and then you get the whole package for free. I mean, I've been in meetings with huge companies and they say, the reason we use Linux. Somebody says, technically this good, and this is good, and all the community's great. And they say, no, it's free. So it's like, okay, yeah, it's free. And it costs them just so little to contribute what tiny little bit of change they need to make it work better for them. And they do, and away they go, and it works well. Hence, it's in my water meter, it's in satellites and automatic cow milking machines, mega super yacht stabilizers. Linux is everywhere now because of that. Make a tiny change, let it work for you, solve your problem, and away you go. But so it's been corporate driven, not in a way, for a long time, but that's good because we want companies to use it for things, right? So Telco got involved really early and said, hey, look, we can throw away all these really expensive sun boxes if we just tweak it a little bit and make things a little bit more robust over here and there, and away we go. And they did.
As you're talking about the kernel community and companies' involvement in the kernel community and ecosystem and how this all works, it just sounds like that it's been working so wonderfully ever since it existed. Now, my personal experience, both working for a company that was not really even trying to contribute to the open source project that they were relying on, it was not the kernel. It was an uphill battle, and I didn't exactly come out as a winner in that one. So like getting companies to even think about investing in the open source project that they are massively relying on for their products that they're already selling, it's not that simple. And then once they get involved, again, my personal experience, both working for companies who were trying to do that, as well as being involved in communities and watching other companies trying to do that. It's not exactly sunshine and rainbows and butterflies, to say the least.
No, I don't want to paper over that at all. It is not. It's an education process, right?
Yeah, I would love to learn how this all evolved in the Linux community, because I'm sure that you had challenges like everybody does. So I don't want to, picture the Linux kernel community as unique in this regard, but I would love to hear how your experience was like being a contributor and then maintainer in the community, and then working with others whose paid job was either 100% of the time or usually some percentage of their time spent on the kernel upstream as part of their paid job. So how did that experience evolve over time? Like, what kind of challenges did you face? Any common misconceptions that just kept showing up over the years that you have to, keep educating people over and over and over again?
Yeah. So I have a talk on here's how the kernel community works. Here's how the kernel's developed. Here's how the whole process works, yada, yada, yada. I gave it once, I think back in 2006. I was like, great, I wrote my talk for once, I'm done. I give that talk a couple times a year ever since then. And I was like, after a couple of years, I'm like, why? Why do I have to keep giving this talk? And my wife says, well, there's a new kindergarten class every year. So it's like, yeah, you have to teach people keep coming in and learning and stuff. So it's fun. So it's an education process. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff interesting. So I worked I'll call it IBM. I worked at IBM for a while, and I wasn't hired into the open source group originally. I transferred over. I was working on Linux there. But even the open source group at IBM was a very traditional company, and one of the rules of IBM was you could never critique another IBMer in public. That was the rule. That was just you can't do that. And as far as big companies go, that makes sense. You don't want to make fun of some other IBMer in public. I reviewed somebody's patch who was sitting like 3 cubicles over from me in public on a mailing list. And that was fine. He didn't care. But then I reviewed somebody who lived in another town, and they went and complained to their manager. Said, hey, you can't critique other IBMers' code in public. I'm like, was I wrong? They're like, no, you weren't wrong. But then you just don't do that. I was like, well, this is how the community works. We contribute in the kernel in public. I don't want you just throwing stuff out of a company, making other people do your work for you, right? We've had problems where companies will just make me be the reviewer because they didn't want to have reviews internally. But this was just some education process. So Dan Fry realized that this needed to change in the corporate policy at IBM, set me up in some funny meetings that I didn't realize I was being set up in, and taught them people that this is how the community works. We contribute, we're discussing code, we're not critiquing people. This is how things work. This is how you learn. This is how you do this. You can't rely on the individuals, because when you submit this stuff, what if I wasn't in the building? I wasn't an IBMer. They're going to critique you from another company. This is the way the community works. You don't contribute code in private. We don't accept private contributions. We want to see this stuff work in public. So teaching the ecosystem of companies that we work in public, you can do initial reviews in private all you want. I really strongly encourage that. Take advantage of the people that are sitting next to you. But we do our work in public, and that was hard. That was learning. And then another one is maintainers. I touched on it earlier. Maintainership follow the person. At IBM, we had a new graduate come in and start working on part of the kernel because nobody was working on that part of the kernel, and became the maintainer. Did a great job. And then he wanted to move to a different division or a different thing. And, or he was told to move to a different thing. And we're like, no, wait, he's still the maintainer. Like, no, we'll take that maintainership away and give it to the new person. We're like, no, that's not how that works at all. It's his, and it's still his. He's changed jobs many times. And he's still doing a great job with that. And maintainerships follow the people. And that's good, because we joke, we've all worked for different companies over the years. Who are you working for this year? It's like, but you're still doing the same thing. You're still working on the same type of thing. And that's good. That's good for the product. That's good for Linux. It's good for the ecosystem. You have our depth of knowledge. You still have new people coming in all the time. You can work on that and rely on that. I'm not forced to go work on something totally new. Famously, Microsoft rewrote their USB stack 3 times because the team got moved off to do something else, and the new team came in. They have to learn from scratch again and do that. I mean, you really want the depth of knowledge for some of this stuff. You can add new people, great, but just don't move the old people away if you want to. So teaching companies that maintainerships follow them. And then when you get hired into a company, you have to be hired in such a way that you're allowed to work in the community. You're allowed to take that work on as part of your paid job. And that's been teaching companies. Companies have had to learn that over the years. And that's a management issue there. And then there's all the whole cultural issues. Japan, famously, I could not speak to you as another engineer unless I had met your manager, or your manager had introduced us before. Just culturally, I couldn't talk to you directly. So emails would have to go through managers, me to your manager, you send the patch to the manager. It was not working. So Linux Foundation realized that very early. We started having meetings, open source conferences in Japan I've been going there for 20 years now, just to do that, to meet people, teach them this is how we work together. Number one, first, I've met you, so now you can talk to me. And also teaching managers that, hey, this isn't a problem. We need to change the culture and we need to work together like that. And then there's also some very good managers in Japan, companies, trying to change their companies to do the right thing there, famously as well. Try and get them to contribute upstream. Tell them it isn't the scary thing. It's okay if somebody critiques your code. It's not a bad thing on you. Famously, one manager was like, he's like, okay, I can't get my engineers to contribute, but so he did some documentation. He translated some documents from English into Japanese, and got the patches in. And then he's like, hey, if I can do this as a mere manager, what your engineers aren't doing? What are you doing? So I mean, that he used the cultural shame in order to change his own company. He's done wonderfully, and he now works for Linux Foundation. He's a great person, but he realized at an early stage that you can use these societal pressures in order to do for good, right? And he did. And I have lots of other fun stories along the cultural issues. But sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's managerial, sometimes it's companies, but it's a lot of people issues. We're all people, right? So it's other people talking to other people. It's not purely technical all the time, because we're not all technical things. We have to deal with those types of stuff. And companies have to learn this. IBM and Intel famously decades ago said it's cheaper and faster to contribute upstream. Yet companies refuse to learn that. There's a Harvard Business Review paper, they refuse to learn that, and they want to find out for themselves. Fine, they can burn the money if they want to, but sometimes teaching them is good, right?
You worked for IBM, and like I remember earlier conversations, you in the Linux kernel context and Linux kernel community context, you were talking about how IBM is successful and how the company got this whole investing in open source right. And you're not the only person that I heard this from. So I would like to dive a little bit further into what was the difference in the case of IBM, because there are several other companies both in the Linux kernel and then overall in the open source ecosystem who didn't really get this whole how to rely on open source right. So what did it take within IBM to get to the point where the company was able to sustainably invest in the Linux kernel upstream and use the open source code and just have that whole loop figured out?
So a lot of that happened before I was there, and I'll call out Dan Fry as the guy who did it right. He convinced management that this was going to work, and they made the bet. IBM made the bet. They put $1 billion into it.
$1 billion. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, so IBM's in the business of selling hardware and services, right? So they want to sell chips or systems. And I was there, they made the very good pitch to some people saying, you can buy our hardware, this platform, or this platform, or this platform, and your same program runs on all of them because it's running on Linux. And this is the first time that they had ever had a cross-hardware platform solution so that they could sell to a small person their x86, their Intel boxes, their bigger systems, the S390 mainframes, which are amazing and run Linux wonderfully. And that's always the future of whatever Linux is doing. It's what those guys are doing. Or the PowerPC stuff in the middle. You could pick and choose whatever, and so they made a very commanding bet on that here we can provide something that's cheaper, because you couldn't make an operating system ecosystem for that price, and that would work for everybody. And it also helped put their competitors out of business. So it was a pretty wise move. So they had management buy-in. And I think that's the key. It's you have to have management buy-in that this is going to be something to do. I see a lot of companies, it's like the engineers want to do something, and then some of the middle managers want to do that, but it stops at a little bit level. Or you have the upper management wanting to do it, and then you have the engineers wanting to do it, but it gets stuck in the middle. Somewhere else doesn't want to do that. Because no one person in the middle wants to take the hit on the initial cost it's going to take for their product. It needs a management top-down for the whole company to buy into this stuff. IBM had that at the time. And they did a good job, and they made their money back. They publicly said it was a business decision, and we made money on it. And IBM makes great money on services now. They don't have as large a Linux kernel team. They still, for some portions of it, do, but they've changed over time as well. Intel has a big Linux kernel system. They used to have none. Then there's other companies like Google has huge kernel divisions that don't contribute anything to upstream, and they suffer for that, for those different parts of the division. But Android has a very, very tiny kernel team and has a huge impact on the ecosystem because they work with upstream. So it's like if you look at it, because the Android management team understands this, that they can get their home, they can do so much more for so much less energy and less resources. So again, it takes management buy-in to do this type of stuff. And that's rare for a lot of companies. Or some companies just want to burn the money. So Qualcomm famously wanted to burn the money because they had it in order to keep their ecosystem of not working upstream until after it was too late. They've now changed that because maybe they don't have so much money to burn. But they publicly admitted that now we're willing to take the hit and the cost to do that. And that was their management decision to do so. It wasn't their engineers. They didn't necessarily like that. So that made it hard for engineers who wanted to work with the ecosystem or the infrastructure to work for them. So when you are a management and you are able to work with upstream and you support your engineers to do that, you open yourself up to a much larger pool of talent to work for you. And they're going to be working for Linux to do the betterment for it, solve your problems, but they'll do that upstream. But that lets you get so much access to much better engineers than you ever had before. There is some companies that famously do not work upstream. And we say, if you are a Linux kernel person, then you don't like working upstream, because some people don't. I mean, that was common at IBM when you had that happen. Some people just did not want other people critiquing stuff. Go work for those companies. So we'll point them at those companies over there. And we all know who those companies are, and I won't say, but there's a place for everybody if you want to work with Linux stuff. But again, management buy-in takes the key. I have a fun story that I told before. Chip company that did Wi-Fi drivers or Wi-Fi chips. They sold chips. They had out-of-tree Wi-Fi drivers, big giant monstrosities. And the CTO of the company said, "We want this stuff in the kernel. We need to get the stuff in the kernel." And then it just wasn't happening. Something was mismatched. The engineers weren't sending it. Something wasn't going on. So I went and visited them over in Asia. Spent a day talking to them, and it was like no feedback loop at all. This talking. Here's how the ecosystem works. Here's how everything's good. Lunch break happened. A bunch of people left. I stayed and ate lunch with the engineers. And when the engineers said, the reason why we're not allowed to do this is because the original code base was written by the CTO. And our managers are really worried that if the code gets submitted to the kernel, that the community is going to rip it out. And that would be not saving face for the CTO, the cultural thing that, his code was wrong or something. And they want to preserve the CTO's original code. And I went and told the CTO, because the CTO is the one who brought me in. He said, "Hey, come and do this." And he's like, "What? I didn't know that. My code was horrible. Of course I don't want this stuff in there. You should rip it out. I'm not a good engineer. I started the company a long, long time ago." So, and then he had to go down and tell his managers, that whole middle chunk of managers, it's okay. We need this done. Let our engineers actually go work in the stuff. So there was a big cultural mismatch there in the middle that you had to drive through in order to make it happen. Now they're working in the community, works great, and all is good. But it took, it's just people. It's a people problem. And it's a management buy-in and agreeing why this needs to happen. And so it can be done. It's hard. It's something like that. But you also
a fortuitive lunch, right?
Fortuitive lunch, yeah.
Because otherwise, everybody would have nodded while you did all of that presentation, and nothing would have ever changed.
Nothing would have changed. Yeah, I got lucky there. I don't know any other ones that did that.
I mean, when it comes to, let's say a company decides that they actually do want to work upstream because it's just the most reasonable thing for them to do. Back to the IBM example, as you worked for IBM, who we just talked about, was successful in this regard. So you mentioned that things were in place when you joined the company. Can you share anything about the practices and the framework that was implemented at IBM to allow people to be able to work upstream in some percentage or 100% of the time? Like, what was the way how IBM managed the upstream investment and involvement?
So IBM they were in the enterprise business, right? They wanted to sell enterprise solutions and robust things like that. They were competing against Sun and Solaris and other Unixes, even AIX. So they had a list of things that for their hardware that they wanted to have work better, right? They had a list based on the marketing reports of other companies, what they supposedly did that Linux didn't do. So they had their open source team, they said, here's the list of things to work on. And then they would manage and parse them out and work on that. And then if the feature got accepted upstream, but not by that developer, rejigger how they do their things like that. Or, oh, look, this subsystem isn't being maintained and needs some help because it's not working well for us. Let's go throw an engineer on that and have them do that. Let's work on this file system to solve this problem and whatnot. They had a really well-defined list of things that they wanted to do. So that's what you need to come in with. It'd be your list of, here's our hardware, and here's what we want to need to support going forward. Here's our new device that we're going to look at. I mean, you look at the ARM chips and the RISC-V chip vendors. They need to get those chips working and get that code upstream. There's a good list. Have those developers work on that, get the stuff upstream, work well on that. IBM, Intel does that really well. Famously, Intel asked us to rip code out once for a chip. We're like, we don't take code out we're not going to break users. Like, no. Sorry, that chip never shipped. So Intel had the code written, reviewed, accepted, in a release before the chip even shipped, and then they canceled the product, so we had to rip it out, which is fine. We're glad to do that, but they were that far ahead of the game, right? So they had a good pipeline, and they knew what they're going. Chip pipelines are 6 years old, or 6 years deep, right? These companies know what's coming. They know how to plan this type of stuff. Your hardware life cycle's a year. You know what you need to do. Fit it into the life cycle. I have a whole talk on how to fit this into your life cycle at the proper time. You can give us code without working hardware. I don't care, as long as it doesn't break my hardware. It's not like you need to have something that runs on. You can give it to us with fake names, right? Code names all the time. Famously, IBM taped out a new chip and brought it up on a standard kernel because all the code had already been merged under a different name of something else, and nobody knew that, and it just worked on their brand new chip. IBM did a really good job with that. So IBM management had a list of things to do, right? So that's all you need to do. You're trying to solve a problem for you. It wasn't that you go work in the upstream community 100% of your time to do whatever you want to do. It's like, here's the task we want to do. And if you're a maintainer, okay, you're maintaining that, and that's good for us as well. When I worked at SUSE in Novell, I ended up managing the kernel team after a while. We had a requirement at the end of the year, you had to work X percentage of time upstream, at least 20% of your time. We have a product, we have all this other stuff. 20% of your time has to be upstream. And if your code if you don't have that requirement of your employees, they're not going to do the stuff because if they're getting reviewed at time. Famously, we have some core kernel maintainers that work for companies that part of their day job, no upstream work is allowed, right? Is not part of their end of year review. These are core people, and I don't know why they like working on that stuff, but that's their business. But their job is not, they can squeak out some time on their own. It's not part of their day job, and that's sad to me as far as that. And we have a whole our company ecosystem on how sustainable maintainership is, from level 0 of you're not allowed to work on the kernel at all to level 5 where you let them do whatever you want to do. And we publish that, and you can grade your company on that list right there. But it depends. But if you are a manager, just say, hey, X number amount of time you have to work upstream. Android, I'll call it Android kernel team again, doing a good job. They made the requirement, if you're going to work on these new features for Android, which they knew they needed to do, you do it upstream first, and then we'll backport it to our kernels. And it's much easier to do it that way. And they told their engineers, this is your job. And some engineers, to their credit, said, I don't really want to do that. So they found jobs working on something else.
Different work.
Yeah, it's different work. And they wanted to go, some of them went to go work on different operating systems, which is fine. But so management said, you have to have the management buy-in order to work upstream. Because the managers knew that would save them money and time, and Android kernel team is very, very tiny, and they're doing really good stuff because of that. So we have lots of public examples of this working well. Why people don't take advantage of that, I don't know.
So like to confirm, like what models that you saw or had, they are rather saying that this is the minimum amount of time that you need to work upstream. Also having this part of yearly reviews and maybe even bonus processes and whatever else corporate organizations have, as opposed to saying that you're maybe allowed to work 20% or 40% max. So it was rather the minimum that they needed to hit.
Yeah, that's what we did at SUSE. We did that. It was a minimum, yeah, and you could do more. You still had to. We had other requirements that you had to do as well. But so if you wanted to do this type of stuff, you would do that. And I'm pretty sure everybody did at least more than 20% of their time in the community. But this is also, we relied on that, and those were now the domain subdomain experts in that part, so they could provide help and support to the customers in that area. So if somebody had a USB bug, because I worked upstream in USB subsystem, I knew how to solve it easier. And I could also send that bug to the community, and I knew the right people to talk to help make it fix it easier as well, because this is a real problem. So it's good. It's good for a company to do that, and because then they're domain expert for that, and they can help. Linux is going to stay the same today, but it will change based on what people contribute, right? If you think it's working perfect, wonderful. If you want to see things change, you need to get involved. So as a company, if you rely on Linux, you want to make sure it evolves in a way that's going to still work for you, right? So become part of that process. Otherwise, it might evolve in a way that isn't going to work for you, which wouldn't be a good idea. So just be part of that process and realize what's coming. You can see what's going to happen next. You can get a heads up for, my product that I'm going to be ship in 3 years. Oh, look, this stuff that's coming down the pipe, maybe if I redo this in a different way, or we can take advantage of this, or we can do this other thing this way. We can just it's a good feedback loop and whatnot. Hardware engineers have the same thing. They see process changes happening over time for companies, present to them about what things they could do differently. It's the same idea as us. So we're not unique that way. We just happen to do our stuff in the open.
Yeah, it's just kind of one thing that I often see as kind of a head scratcher for companies in terms of what is that framework that would work in terms of how people split their time between open source project and their downstream product, and how to figure those things out and how not to have it as a conflict. And I think sometimes there is the conception that, if a person works upstream, then they will have to work upstream 100%. They absolutely don't have to do that.
We have almost no people that do that.
Yeah.
We don't have people that do that. Yeah, it's just not. I'll send you a link. You can put on the thing that shows our grade of company based on how you work with the open source community. That it's been published for a couple of years. Ted So wrote it. It did a really good job. But it's also unique and special to your special issues. I've worked for different companies, and we all treated that differently because we were creating different things and working on different things. But we knew that you needed to rely on that and do it some way, right? Because it was important. So there's no one answer fits all, but you have to have buy-in, and you have to be something that is at the end of the year something that the employee has to do in order to do that, or otherwise they're just not going to do that. And rightfully so. If you're not going to grade me on my open source,
it's what they're incented for. Yeah,
they're incentives. Yes, that's the right word. Yeah.
But for me, that's why it is really important that it's senior leadership and then those line managers who have that appreciation. And that's often the difficulty, is the transition from the way companies have done things in the past when things were all proprietary and internal, to when you're really relying on those platforms evolving to the best benefit for your application as you need it next year and the year before and the year after and so forth, right? So it's an investing in the future, where when you haven't done it before, you don't know what that return on investment is going to be, because this working upstream, what's the benefit? What am I going to get out of that? Because it's not really known. Until it is known, then it's an easy thing to do. But it's that transition for those managers I often see as one of the problems in getting there.
Yeah, but this isn't new. We've been doing this for 25 years in companies. This isn't a new thing. This has been around for longer now.
Before we depart, Greg, can you please share something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech, open source, the Linux kernel, some kind of a hobby or fun fact?
I used to live outside of Seattle and on an island outside of Seattle. Now I live in the Netherlands. When I was there, I ended up, when I was in university and before, I used to surf. And I made money through university. I fixed surfboards, so I did a lot of fiberglass repair. So when I was living in Bainbridge, across from Seattle, I decided to build a kayak. So I built a wooden kayak. I had some pictures somewhere around, but it's a 16-foot long, single-person wooden kayak. Took me about 3 years, way too long. My wife is like, I'm going to buy one for her, so she wouldn't have to wait another 3 years. And it weighs about, I think, 10 kilograms heavier than it should because I made a lot of mistakes. But I still have the kayak. It's still a nice kayak. So I need to use it more, but I still have it with me here in the Netherlands. So
Nice.
Yeah. I still surf. So we're on the ocean here. Still get a chance to surf. And that's where I learned public speaking. I ended up being the president of our University of Florida Surf Club. And if I can get drunk surfers to make it to a contest on time, I can talk to anybody.
That's amazing. I love that because I mean, getting into public speaking, then that could be a whole other hours of conversation in terms of giving tips to people because it's really not easy in my personal experience.
No, it's not.
So were you like kayaking around the Sound, the Puget Sound?
Yeah. So you can go out. There's a little rock island right off the island that you could kayak to, or you can go around. And then we had a double. Also, my kids and my wife and I could do it. So yeah.
And that's where Ildiko is. She's sitting in a boat on a lake in Seattle or outside of Seattle. Yes.
So Bainbridge. So yeah, if you look at, you could put it on top of my car and then drive down I lived about a mile from the ocean or from the Sound.
Nice.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that little island. I usually take not usually, sometimes I go and take the ferry between Bainbridge and Seattle because you get the whole Seattle view with the skyline and everything, and it's so pretty on a nice day.
It is nice. It's nice. You end up having to rely on that ferry a little too often, and it gets tough after a few years. Because it's like, oh, I have to leave at this point in time at night because we got to catch that ferry. Otherwise, we're going to be here till 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Or, oops, I can't get that early flight out because the ferry doesn't run that morning. And then now the ferries aren't running as well anymore. So it ends up being a little difficult at times. But it's a different type of life.
Yeah, part of the reason I don't live on the island, ferry.
Is Bainbridge where the weather is different? Where's the spot near Seattle where the weather is like it doesn't rain nearly as much as the rest of Seattle? Am I thinking of the right city, or is that Portland that has this weird?
I don't know. There's a point off in the Sound that has the worst weather that is famously known for that because it just happens to be on the way the windward.
It must be out of Portland then. There's some place that is not tropical. And it's actually like more sunny.
I lived in Portland for 10 years. I don't know.
Did you? You're not recognizing that one either?
No, I don't. No, maybe not where
I'm pretty sure it was Ava. It was Ava who was telling me about this. Actually, a long time ago in the early OpenStack days.
Maybe there might be.
If the place still exists,
you want to go?
I might consider. I mean, depending on how big the place is, but yeah, if there's like I don't know, a little town area or something, I'll just go and like drive my car around in circle on all those sunny days.
Well, so the weather here is the same as weather you. I mean, that's like the same degrees, same cloudiness. Somebody was saying, oh, we had 3 weeks of no sun. And I was like, oh, did we? I didn't realize that. So I'm used to it. It's the same weather.
Are you in Amsterdam or are you outside of there?
I'm in The Hague.
Oh, that's right. You're The Hague. Okay.
Yeah. So Amsterdam is the big city it's 45 minutes away. It's a tiny country.
Right.
Yeah, I like The Hague. I've only been out a couple of times, but it's, peace and quiet. And then if you need to go into the big city, it's not too far. So
it is the second biggest city in the country. So it is still, or third. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, then The Hague. 500,000 people. It's pretty size.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, but you just go out to the water and then it just feels so peaceful still.
Yeah, we got an ocean. We got the beach. The beach here is amazing. It's great.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today.
We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is a silver bullet.
That's what you need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you